Is it possible to be a disciple of Jesus without living in poverty? No, it is not. We Christians have been pretty successful, I think, at deluding ourselves on this topic, and I think the delusion, for the sake of the gospel, should stop now. First of all, what is a disciple? A disciple is not merely a student, and a disciple is not merely one who confesses that Jesus is Lord. From one of the all-time greatest sources of knowledge, wikipedia.org, the disciple desired to learn not only the teaching of the rabbi, but to imitate the practical details of their life. A disciple did not merely attend lectures or read books. They were required to interact with and imitate a real living person. A disciple would literally follow someone in hopes of eventually becoming what they are. So to be a disciple of someone else is not just to learn from them, not just to love them, but to copy them, to live their life, to become their duplicate. Jesus lived an impoverished life. He did not live a particularly comfortable life. He lived as a vagrant. Specifically, that meant that he did not live consistently in one house or apartment. He did not have the massive things that one might accumulate in a house or apartment. He did not have a normal money-making job or any other stable income stream. He did not have a personal bank account or a retirement fund or a stock portfolio. If he at one point had any of those things, he left them behind when he began his ministry. That is what his life looked like. Moreover, Jesus made it clear that his lack of stuff was not incidental. It was very important. He explicitly told his disciples to sell their possessions and give to the needy. He told them not to worry about the precarity of poverty, about how they would get food or how they would clothe themselves. He told them to seek the kingdom and have full trust that the Father would provide for them. He said, straight up, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. I could end the video right there, but I'll continue. The disciples listened and they did what he said. They imitated the Lord in his poverty. Peter said, "See, we have left everything and followed you." Jesus sent the 12 apostles to travel around preaching and healing with no bag, no money, no extra clothes, no plans for shelter. He expected them to rely on random people to house them and feed them. They went in poverty as he commanded. Then Jesus sent 72 others who were not apostles to do the same things in the same way. They also went in poverty as he commanded. Jesus looked like a poor man, wandering and preaching and healing without any stuff, and that's how his disciples looked as well. It was not enough to be emotionally detached from your stuff, to be theoretically willing to leave it behind if Jesus commanded it. There's no mention in the Gospels of a disciple who stayed in the comfort of their own home with their spouse and their kids, hanging on to their normal full-time work. A disciple, like Jesus himself, had already left all of it behind. In the Acts of the Apostles, communities of disciples are mentioned, and they seem to have more stability at that point. Like they tended to stay mostly in one city and preach there rather than traveling around. But there is no scriptural evidence that these disciples had houses or possessions. Paul, one of the greatest disciples and imitators of Jesus, said to the Corinthians that he and his fellow apostles hunger and thirst. They are poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless. He says this in the midst of gently making fun of the Corinthians for being rich. And then he begs the Corinthians to be imitators of him as he is of Christ. Relatedly, in none of Paul's writings do we see him referring to believers as disciples, because most believers were not, in fact, disciples of Jesus. Building on that, I want to say that you don't need to live in terror of your salvation because you live a normal life with a normal amount of possessions rather than the life of a disciple. Most people to whom Jesus brought salvation were not disciples. I think first of Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham." Zacchaeus gave away a lot, but not everything. And there is no mention of him becoming a follower of Jesus. Yet the Lord declares that salvation has come to his house. It is the same with most of the Lord's healings and exorcisms. He demands of them nothing but their faith, and they seem to return to their normal lives, but with the joy of the blessings that Jesus has given them. They don't become disciples, and that is not a problem. I also want to bring up something especially for my fellow Catholics, something that in the Catholic Church is confusingly called religious life. In the Catholic Church, not everyone who is religious, who believes and who goes to church, is a part of religious life. It is a separate thing. You enter religious life when you take a certain set of special vows. This is almost always done within the context of a group that lives according to their own rule of life. Some of the most famous of these groups are the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Benedictines, and the Dominicans. The newest Pope, Leo XIV, took the vows of religious life with a group called the Augustinians. I bring up the ancient institution of religious life because one of the vows that all religious take is a vow of poverty. And this vow has led to more controversy and confusion than any other. The consensus interpretation around the vow of poverty in the Catholic Church is that you as an individual, once you take that vow, cannot have wealth. However, your group that you join, as a group, can have wealth and possessions. So what has tended to happen is that zealous groups of believers have arisen. They choose to take these religious vows and they live in genuine poverty and they are very fruitful. But because people genuinely appreciate these groups and they donate to them, and these groups last for centuries, they tend to accumulate wealth. And so even though the members of the group each technically own nothing, the lifestyle of the group as a whole will grow more and more comfortable, sometimes even downright luxurious. This is a big reason why backlash has arisen in various periods against monks and friars and other forms of religious. They were supposed to be held up as holier and closer to the Lord than everyone else. They took these vows of poverty, but their lifestyles were usually much more materially comfortable and secure than that of the average peasant. It was not rare for a peasant's landlord to be a Benedictine monastery to whom they needed to pay rent. Unfortunately, I think this problem still exists in Catholic religious life. The vow of poverty is lived very differently in different communities, but in general, I do not think that the vow tends to lead to the type of poverty required for a disciple. I think that in the average community of vowed religious, the standard of life is not much different from the average American middle class or even upper middle class home. So to Catholics who might want to say that religious life is where the poverty of discipleship is lived out, and that those who want to live as disciples can simply enter religious life, I disagree. I can imagine religious being willing to do the self-examination and make the changes to bring their poverty in line with that of Jesus, but I do not think this has yet happened in most communities. So the witness that comes from Jesus' poverty, the willing poverty of a disciple, is not easy to find within the church today. That is a big problem. Believers are quick to make excuses for the church we love, but non-believers can and do read the Bible. They can see what Jesus demanded of his disciples, and they can also see that none of us live that way. Can they be faulted for not taking us seriously as believers in Jesus and proclaimers of his gospel? Not everyone is necessarily called to be a disciple who imitates Jesus in his poverty, but I think some of us, maybe even many of us, are. We just need to be willing to acknowledge the call to leave everything and to go. I am seeking believers who feel a specific call to be imitators of Jesus in the field of politics, who feel called to concretely build up the justice of the kingdom of God by being poor men and women in political office. If you feel a desire to do that same work, or if you feel called to contribute to the project of building up the kingdom while still maintaining a more normal life, either way, send me an email. May the kingdom of God come.